Next presentation, which is by Selin Grollmann, Syncretism in the Agreement Morphology of Kiranti, Areal, and Diachronic Implications.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, perfect. Can you share your screen?
Yes, will. Okay. So can you see my screen?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Very good. Okay, so welcome to my presentation about syncretism in the agreement morphology of Kiranti. I actually hope that my brain will be able to stay awake because it's 4 o'clock in the morning here in Switzerland, but I'll do my best. So my talk is going to focus on the following points. After a short introduction, I will concentrate on a specific aspect of syncretism in Kiranti, namely on how historical syncretisms were differentiated by means of innovative agreement prefixes. So we will look at some recurring patterns and then discuss some implications of these observations. So Kiranti languages are spoken in Eastern Nepal. This is a group of approximately 30 languages, which all exhibit complex biaccentual agreement morphology, which can index person, number, or clusivity distinctions of 1 or 2 syntactic arguments. So the agreement morphology is originally primarily suffixing, but in languages of the southeastern region of the Kiranti is the region in Nepal where the Kiranti languages are spoken, also exhibit agreement prefixes. And these languages belong to the subgroups Greater Yaka, Limbu, Southern Kiranti, and then there are also prefixes in Dumi and Kaling. They're somewhat outside this southeastern nucleus. So prefixes are assumed to be innovative, except perhaps the prefix me, the third person plural agent marker, and the second person da prefix. I will use the term syncretism in this talk as referring to agreement forms or paradigm cells, which can be differentiated semantically and with the according personal pronouns, but which are expressed identically on the verb. And this will include both inherited syncretism and new syncretism, which, for example, arose from the decline of agreement morphology. So Kiranti languages have complex paradigms, but not every possible cell is usually formally differentiated. And to illustrate this, we'll have a look at the past paradigm of Kulung, which belongs to this Kambu subgroup, and which exhibits only agreement suffixes. So the table here includes both the transitive and intransitive paradigms with the interaction of the A argument here in the row and the O argument in the columns. And here on the right, in the rightmost column, you have the intransitive subject. So as we can see here, not every cell exhibits a distinct marker. For example, here, the first person non-singular acting on the second person does not differentiate the number and clusivity of the agent. And furthermore, these forms are also identical with the forms on third person acting on second person. Kulung has also merged the formal marking of a second person singular and of a third person marker. So these are all Kulung specific innovations probably. But something which is found in many Kiranti languages is that the dual forms, like this here, are not specified for person. So this seems to be a common, if not potentially inherited Kiranti syncretism. Now let's have a look at the Kiranti language, which also has agreement prefixes. Here's the Nonpast paradigm of Puma from the southern subgroup. And here I have highlighted all the cells where prefixes occur with yellow, so that we can see that this is quite a lot of cells with prefixes and only a few which have purely suffixing forms. Additionally, I have highlighted the individual prefixes with individual colors, and some of these, such as the da prefix here, have actually quite regular distribution. So da occurs more or less everywhere where a second person is involved. And others are less regular or even non-functional in their distribution, like these ones down here. And it's like this pa prefix, for example. And it's some of them which are going to be the focus of my talk. So what is the aim of the question and the questions of this talk? First, why have these prefixes been innovated in the first place, especially when other Kiranti languages such as Kulung did not innovate prefixes, and why in the southeastern languages especially. And second, how did the funny distribution of some of these prefixes come about? And my aim will be to show that prefixes have been innovated in southeastern Kiranti languages for the disambiguation of historical syncretisms in the paradigm. And for this, I've examined a few languages which belong to different subgroups. So Yaka, Belhare, Atbare, and Chintang from the Greater Yaka subgroup, then Pedab Limbu, and Bantua, Chamling, and Puma of the Southern subgroup. I've also looked at Dumi and Kaling, which lie outside the southeastern region, but I won't talk about these languages in detail here. And I'll have to put a disclaimer here too. The paradigms and agreement systems are quite complex, and therefore this examination is naturally restricted to a selected set of prefixes and paradigm cells. So before we turn to the syncretism patterns, I'd like to present the prefixes I'm going to talk about and their etymologies. So most of the prefixes have transparent etymologies, namely deriving from nominal possessive prefixes, and have probably entered the verbal paradigm only recently or more recently. And as we can see here in this table, in most of these languages, the prefix, the person of the possessive prefix and the verbal agreement prefix is the same. But there are also languages where a certain prefix underwent a semantic shift from possessive prefix to agreement prefix, like in Atpare and Chintang, the A prefix, which is a first person possessive prefix, which shifted to an inclusive marker, and from there to a second person marker. So in both languages, the A prefix is the sole index for a second person in an intransitive paradigm. For other prefixes, there is no certain etymology or obvious source. So for example, Chamling and Puma, the Pa prefix, maybe it could derive from a nominalizer, but this is mere speculation at the moment. So as for how the prefixes entered the agreement paradigm and got their present distributions, I propose the following diachronic scenario. As a possible preliminary, but not a prerequisite, there might have been decline of original agreement morphology, which led to syncretisms in certain cells of the paradigm. Then in the second step, these syncretisms were repaired or disambiguated via the introduction of a prefix. And then in the final step, the prefix could have been analogically extended to other configurations as well. So I suppose that in the history of these paradigms, there have been several syncretisms which have been resolved, and I'm going to call these historical syncretisms, which I define as forms which are nowadays only differentiated by the agreement prefix and which are assumed to have formerly been identical, for example, in their suffixes or in not having a marker at all. So in these forms, the presence or absence of a certain prefix is nowadays the only contrast between the two cells. Such forms are found both within the transitive paradigm and across the transitive and intransitive paradigms, and concern the categories of person, syntactic role, or number. And I'd like to discuss 3 patterns of historical syncretisms and how they are resolved in the following, if they have been resolved in a particular language. So we have also languages where the syncretism is not disambiguated. So the first pattern, A, concerns syncretism of first and third person in S and A roles, especially in dual number. The pattern is schematically represented in this paradigm here on the left, and the blue cells indicate the historical syncretism. So this kind of syncretism tended to be differentiated by the explicit indexation of a third person with a prefix X, like indicated here on the right. Here are some examples of this pattern. So in these languages, we can observe that on the right side, the suffixes are exactly the same as suffixes here on the left and right side. And but the third person dual forms all here have an additional prefix. So chintang u and belhare the unspecified nasal n, bantoa ö, and chamling pumapa. One exception to this pattern is, however, limbu. Here it is not an explicit index of a third person, which disambiguates the form, but an inclusive marker a, which is added to the first person dual form here. So the second pattern B concerns syncretisms of S and O roles. These are again the green colored cells here, which indicate the historical syncretisms. And this is actually the expected pattern of an ergative alignment of verbal agreement, which is often found in Kiranti languages. But somehow these languages tend to innovate or disambiguate these forms with an additional index for the third person A role. So these forms here get an additional prefix, but for the third person index. Here again, some examples. So in all these languages, the S role verb form here on the left does not have a prefix, while the O role in the configuration with a third person agent gets an additional prefix, like n in Belhare or ö in Bantu and so forth. Now the third pattern C concerns historical syncretisms in number, especially of third person S and A. So there are historical syncretisms in third person singular and third person plural here in orange. And this kind of historical syncretism gets resolved by the explicit indexation of the third person plural S and A index here with a X. Examples for pattern C can be again found in Apare, Chintang, Yaka, and Belhare. Again, the prefixes are the minimal contrast, which differentiates the forms on the left from the forms on the right. So what I'm suggesting here is that these disambiguation patterns can explain some of the unexpected cells of the distribution of a prefix by taking a paradigmatic perspective and taking also into account other prefix-less cells. But not all cells with prefixes can be led back to disambiguation of historical syncretisms. So instead, these instances could be explained with analogical extension due to a certain paradigmatic pressure. So I suppose that prefixes were also spread to cells where no historical syncretism has to be assumed. So there was no need for disambiguation. Therefore, they were analogically extended. I shall exemplify this with the third person prefix U in Chintang. Here's the non-past paradigm. And again, these three patterns, which I've just discussed, are represented in the same colors. So blue shows the differentiation of a first person dual versus third person dual with this U prefix. Then green shows the differentiation of a first person singular O role from a first person singular S role. And the orange ones here show the differentiation of a third person singular from a third person non-singular A role. So, but U occurs also in these yellow cells here. And here there is no need for disambiguation because there is no other cell in the whole paradigm which has the same suffixes but no prefix. So What is assumed here is that the yellow cells represent an analogical extension of the U prefix, first in analogy to these cells here, so from a second person acting on a first person singular, where the same suffixes are attested but with the R prefix. And secondly, also in analogy to these cells here on the right, to the third person non-singular acting on a third person. So the yellow cells are actually influenced by other neighboring cells of the paradigm. So after having illustrated these patterns, I'd like to turn to two implications of these observations. First, an areal consideration. The occurrence of prefixes actually cross-cuts assumed genetic boundaries within Kiranti, so it's not limited to a certain subgroup of Kiranti. The prefixes involved are also not cognate, and thus materially there are not a shared innovation of these languages, which could be seen as a reason to subgroup them. Additionally, it seems implausible to assume parallel independent need for disambiguation, because other subgroups, such as Kambu and Apurarun, did not innovate agreement prefixes, despite having also several syncretisms in their paradigms. So rather, it is assumed that the prefixes represent an areal pattern, since they occur in a geographically contiguous area, if we ignore Dumi and Kali for a moment, in the southeastern Kirant. Therefore, it is postulated here that the innovation of prefixes due to disambiguation is an areal feature of a Sprachbund in the southeastern Kirant. And this is in line with findings of Ebert and Gensler and Bickel and Gensler, who observed also other linguistic features confined to the southeastern region of Kiranti. So this is not an entirely new idea. And here I have taken a map of a publication by Bickel and Gensler and highlighted the languages where prefixes do occur with yellow circles. I hope you can see it, so that it becomes obvious that this concentration of prefixes is here in the southeast. And here's Kathmandu, just for orientation. So the second implication of the proposed disambiguation scenario concerns the issue of inverse. Previous publications have analyzed certain of these prefixes as inverse. So this is because the distribution of these prefixes is somewhat similar to a canonical inverse distribution, in that they occur in third person on first person, and sometimes also third person acting on second person, and third person non-singular acting on a third person singular. And most of the southeastern languages, the prefixes are in most of the southeastern languages do not occur in second on first person, but this would also belong to the canonical inverse distribution. So the reason why these prefixes are sometimes not analyzed as simple third person non-singular agent indexes is that they do not occur in a third person singular on a third person singular. This configuration, which would count as a direct configuration, but in third person non-singular acting on a third person singular, which counts as inverse distribution. And in this context, I'd like to propose an alternative explanation for this distribution, namely that disambiguation and analogical spreading actually led to the present distribution of the prefixes, so that the distribution is assumed to be a diachronic accident and functionally unmotivated. So inverse distribution is a kind of epiphenomenon of the disambiguation process, but the distribution is not due to an inherent inverse function of these prefixes. And let me illustrate this point with the Jamling prefix ba. Jamling belongs to the southern subgroup, and Ebert has previously analyzed this pa prefix as an inverse prefix. As you can see, the prefix occurs in all the dark colored cells down here, which is actually what my analysis with disambiguation of historical syncretism would predict. And again, the individual colors indicate the three patterns which I've discussed above. So the distribution of the pa prefix, including the non-occurrence of pa in these red framed cells here, actually does not ask for an explanation in terms of a functional category such as inverse, but could be sufficiently explained through disambiguation of historical syncretisms. So now let's turn to my conclusion. The assumption of a stepwise spread of the prefixes through disambiguation and analogical extension can help to disentangle synchronically non-functional distributions. A diachronic and paradigmatic perspective is important here because this may explain why certain forms needed to be disambiguated because there were historical syncretisms. And in the context of Kiranti, disambiguation from other cells is seen as a driving force for the introduction of agreement prefixes into the verbal paradigms of the southeastern Kiranti languages. And this development is assumed to be an areal feature of a southeastern Kiranti Sprachbund. So that's all from my side. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you. Any questions?
Oh, well, yeah, I have a lot. Probably
I thought so.
Yeah. To start with, so you said the only inherited prefixes are the second person T and the plural ma?
Yes, I said that, yes.
Yes. And so I take it you meant that. But that means that you do not equate the U prefix that you've been talking about with the inverse U prefix of Gerongic? Because it's got very the same distribution and looks like the same vowel. Well,
yes, I know, but I don't know if it's really, if you look at the U prefix, for example, in Bantoa, it's, so there's a quite obvious synchronic source for this with the third person possessive prefix. That's why it seems like a transparent like intrusion into the verbal paradigm from the nominal prefix. And of
course, people say that about Jurong also, where there is a third person pronominal U. And they'll say,
yeah, but then I'm not sure if I'm convinced that it would belong to the reconstructed verbal system.
Wait, in Jurong?
More to the nominal system.
In Jurong?
No, I'm just talking of Kiranti now.
Ah, okay, yeah. Okay, I had another question. You and Pascal have a paper circulating around which, to my mind, sort of convincingly casts some doubt on the genetic unity of Kiranti, right?
Well, yeah, it's just questioning, yeah.
If you are correct in the implications of that paper, that makes this paper in a way a little less necessary, because if Western and Central Kiranti and Southeastern Kiranti are not part of the same clade, then you don't really need to work so hard to explain why some of them have prefixes and some of them don't.
Well, the Kambu languages and Upper Arun languages would still be in the kind of Eastern Kiranti clade, so and they don't have prefixes, and so it seems to me because
and they don't have prefixes. I'm sorry,
no, they don't have prefixes.
I'm interrupting, but my own pet theory here has to do with a Sprachbund areal loss of prefixes. Moving west from the Arun Valley.
Yeah,
and that would
that's interesting.
That connection. I think they all started out with at least some prefixes.
Yes. So the idea that there was that this Sprachbund which concerns languages which have the prefix like in a positive way, also occurred to me in the context of other morphology or features which the languages there share. So they have some traits, they innovate some prefixes which are not, or not only prefixes, let's say, which are not materially cognate. So, and it's very much looks like calking from each other. So there are other reasons for this Sprachbund which I have in mind, but which I didn't talk about here in detail. But yeah, the other way around is also interesting, yeah.
Or something in between. If you imagine that they all came out of Proto-Trans-Himalayan with a few prefixes, and then we can have two Sprachbunds, right?
Sure.
In fact, where people are sort of differentiating themselves from each other by either not using those silly prefixes or by using as many as they can think of.
Yeah.
Okay, all of which, of course, is totally unprovable, but sort of, I guess my suggestion is that I think your suggestion is also sort of unprovable. Okay, I should shut up. Somebody else have a question?
We have time for more questions. Sorry,
Problem
please.
not having handouts and not being able to go back and kind of, you know,
Yeah,
the formulated question that I was speaking of, but
do you want me to just show the slides again? Or is it just too late?
okay, well, thank you for staying up late or getting up very early to present this great paper. It was really interesting, especially coming right after Alex's. So look at
Yes,
different
yes,
patterns and yeah.